first impressions when Hooker does come west. I've got to start with Sherman. And Sherman, in a letter to his wife, describes Hooker as envious, imperious, and a braggart. He goes on to say he's self-prevailed with him, and knowing him intimately, I honestly preferred Howard. Nobody says he knew him intimately. There are all kinds of rumours about Sherman and Hooker and run-ins they had pre-war in California. And one of the prevailing ones is that aside from Hooker's boredom, which seemed to turn his mind to wine, women and song in California, which, to be fair, Grant's antebellum career caused him to turn to at least one of those three. Hooker got into the land business, and it seems he may have borrowed money. Now, something that's not often mentioned is that Sherman was quite the businessman out west in California and had a bank. And one of the prevailing rumours is that Hooker defaulted on a loan that had been provided to him by Sherman's bank. And I should also throw in that one of the other rumoured investors was Halleck. So that's a story that's sort of prevalent in sort of the early 1900s. I haven't got any further back from that, and I'll talk about Hooker's biography at a later point. But it would certainly explain some of the raw hatred Sherman has for Hooker long before Hooker ever comes west. Because Sherman is writing fairly offensive comments about Hooker from about 1862 to friends and family. It's fairly obvious he absolutely detests the man. But it's not just Sherman we have to talk about. What did the troops, seeing Hooker for the first time, and some troops who'd served under Hooker out east? Well, John Quincy Adams Campbell, he's 5th Iowa man. He's the finest looking Major General I've seen. Well built, good looking, florid complexion, Presbyterian whiskers, and looks every inch the soldier. There's another chap, Charles Harding Cox, the 17th Indiana. We all have great confidence in Hooker and esteem him highly. That's what the outset of the campaign. And it does seem to be that huge dichotomy in views. I mean, just take the line from Grant's memoirs. Hooker, a dangerous man. He was not subordinate to his superiors. He was ambitious to the extent of caring nothing for the rights of others. The other end of the spectrum, Lincoln's writing around this time. Whenever trouble arises, I can always rely upon Hooker's magnanimity. It's another issue that when Hooker goes out west, there are already a number of former members of the Hooker fan club who have already been sent out west. So the likes of Baldy Smith have already spread some fairly anti-Hooker views long before he arrives. Baldy Smith being an arch McClellanite and Hooker being very much the opposite. And I have to say, talking about Hooker in the Eastern Theatre, I have always had it rather easy because having a go at McClellanites is not just a duty, it's a pleasure. But moving into the West, I'm afraid I'm going to be taking on some of the Sherman fans, which I suspect will be a much harder task. Hooker had some fairly serious concerns after his performance at Lookout Mountain, and having interacted with Sherman and Grant afterwards, one of the things he wrote was, "They will clearly never forgive me for having knocked all their plans into a cocked hat by a single move at Lookout Mountain." He's also not a big fan of Sherman's from the get-go. Please remember what I tell you, Sherman is an active, energetic officer, but in judgment, he is as infirm as Burnside. That's been writing to Chase. And that's another important point to make about Hooker. Hooker is incredibly political in a way that Thomas isn't, in a way that Howard isn't, in a way that Sherman definitely is. So I've talked about the California rumors. I'll talk very briefly about 20 Corps. That's the merger of the two small corps that come with him. He's placed in Thomas's Army of Cumberland, and it's a very solid corps. Alpheus S. Williams is very sound indeed. John White Geary, a bit more of an average performer, political general, but inexperienced. Dan Butterfield has been an experienced brigade commander. He's been chief of staff for Hooker. I think he proves to be sound, at least in battle. I think in later life he will prove to be anything but in financial matters. And I'll come back to William T. Ward later in the talk. But those are the men serving under his command, and I have to say, Hooker has seemed to have a really good relationship with all of them. Now, Hooker's delighted with the idea of campaigning, marching towards Atlanta. Somebody commented on him, he genuinely seemed to be happy on campaign. And he's supposed to have said at one point, his highest form of enjoyment was campaigning in an enemy's country. Now, very quickly it became clear that one thing Hooker had a reputation for in the East was looking after his men and being a good administrator. And I think that carries through now. And he did quickly win the respect and love of the men who served under him. George F. Cram of the 105th Illinois, with regards to Hooker, everybody loves him. And to see him as he rides along our lines is only to love him more each time. I think Hooker would have been delighted to hear that. Now, things kick off, and the campaign starts, and Hooker, of course, is writing to his political friends, writing to Zachariah Chandler, I'm off to the front. Not that I'm looking for a considerable fight, but where there is one, I like to be counted in. He talks an excellent fight. Now, his commander would be Thomas, and I think it might surprise a lot of people to know Hooker thought Thomas was great, really respected him, respected the style of leadership and the way he fought. And indeed, would go as far as to say he is Sherman's superior in every respect. And it's strange to hear that, given Hooker's reputation, which is for knifing superior commanders. But he doesn't do it with Thomas. I haven't come across a single record of him, either in the army or to his political contacts, having a bad word to say about Thomas. And the impression I get from Thomas is that given a choice, he's going to put Hooker in the front. He's going to rely on Hooker more than his other two corps commanders. Now, we start off. Some of you who've been dozing may have only a vague familiarity with that map, but the rest of us have seen it 4 or 5 times. Start off with the advance towards Rocky Face Ridge, and this idea that McPherson is going to slip through Snake Creek Gap and get into Joe Johnston's line of communication. Now, there's going to be a gap opening up between the Army of the Cumberland and McPherson's army, and in order to ensure that somebody reliable is there, Thomas puts Hooker on his right, and in between the two are Kilpatrick's cavalry. Now, in front of Hooker are Buzzard's Roost Gap and Doug's Gap. Now, Hooker reconnoiters those himself, and with Butterfield they have a good look at Buzzard's Roost and describe it as very ugly. And in terms of Doug Gap, Geary has very strict instructions. He's to try and seize Doug Gap, but without a serious fight. And as I say, Geary is probably the weakest of the 3 divisional commanders, and does take on a big fight and get repulsed. But McPherson does get into position, but he doesn't impress. He bottles it, in fact, not to put too fine a point on it. And Joe Johnston gets to pull out. Now, it seems to be the case that it's felt that McPherson needs a bit of stiffening and a bit of support on that side. And who gets sent? It's the experienced Hooker that gets sent through Snake Creek Gap in support of McPherson. In any event, Joe Johnston pulls back to Resaca, the 12th and 13th of May. And it's at this point that John Schofield tells an interesting story about Sherman and Hooker. They and their staffs are on a hill, apparently, near Resaca. They're having a look at dispositions. They're under a bit of fire, and anyway, the staff leave the hill, but Sherman and Hooker are still on the hill. They're not looking at one another, they're not talking to one another, they're just sat on their horses looking out over the dispositions. And they stay there, and they stay there, because neither, according to Schofield, wants to be the first one to leave. And Schofield notes that at one moment, as if by agreement, the two of them moved off simultaneously. Now that's a great story, and Schofield, I would say, is not the most reliable person, but a similar story is told by one of Thomas's staff officers, that a group of senior officers are eating at a table that's been carried out of a house, and all of them slowly excuse themselves after finishing the meal and leave, except at either end of the table are sat Sherman and Hooker. And again, neither one of them wants to be the one to excuse himself and demur to the other. And it's actually the staff officer who goes up and says, I have never seen two grown men more like schoolboys. And both laugh and get up and leave the table. It gives you, if not an impression of what two true stories, it at least gives you an impression of what people like Schofield and Thomas's staff officers, it's the impression that they had. These were the stories that people carried away about the relationship between Hooker and Sherman. Anyway, at Resaca, Sherman's dispositions leave a lot to be desired. And if you're going to have someone exposed on the flank, Hooker would tell you that O. Howard is not the guy. And specifically, it's Stanley's division that's hung out to dry. Now, dear old Hood never misses up an opportunity to attack, and he has a go at Howard. Almost immediately, Howard is asking Thomas for help, and who does Thomas turn to? It's Hooker at the head of Williams' division. And I can imagine how delighted Hooker was to be going to the relief of O.O. Howard and exposed on the flank. That would have brought back memories for him. William Wallace of the 3rd Wisconsin saw Hooker ride by. Now you will see from him on he saw the division race past. And he says, now you will see from him as they are all on a full run with Joe Hooker at their head. So Stanley's men are basically surrendering in droves by about 5 p.m. until Hooker and Williams turn up and basically drive Hood's men back to their starting position. Now, let's get through that. Hooker tries one of his rare direct approaches to Sherman to try and talk him into an attack. And again, another rare occurrence, Sherman finds himself agreeing with Hooker's proposal. And there is a joint attack between Howard and Hooker on, I think, 15th of May. Howard kicks off at 1 p.m. And within about an hour has given it up as a bad job. Hooker's attack with Geary and Butterfield kicks off at 1:30. Now, it's terrible ground. It's not good ground to attack over. And those troops only managed to seize a single 4-gun battery. which I'll come back to in a moment. So Hooker calls it off and pulls back. But Hood, who sometimes reminds me of a Second World War German general, always counterattacks. Or, if he's allowed to, always counterattacks. And as soon as Hooker pulls back, Hood does counterattack. But Hooker is completely prepared. Williams is dug in. If one thing that Hooker has learned from the East is he always ought to be dug in and prepared for an attack. And Hood's counterattack is shattered on Williams's prepared positions. Now, and I'm going to say this a lot because I think we all have, Joe Johnston retreats again. But as Hooker's 20th Corps marches through one of the abandoned camps, a letter is found, and it's from the commander of the battery that was taken. And one of the lines that was repeated to anyone that would listen is a line in the letter that said, "None but Joe Hooker's men could have captured this battery." So whatever Sherman thinks, some of the Southerners had a rather impressed view of Hooker and 20 Corps. So as Joe Johnston retreats, Hooker's crossing an Irishman pronouncing some of these Native American river names, I apologise in advance, crossing the Conestoga River at Files Ferry, then he's crossing the Coosawattee. Now, the crossing he was given was unusable, so he moves further down the river to McClure's Ford and Fields Ferry and constructs a bridge. Now, that means he's very much getting in Schofield's way. Now, Schofield is the arch political general, even though he's a regular, because he plays politics and always has the knife out when he knows there's an opportunity. And Schofield knows his audience, so he takes every opportunity to write to Sherman. Every time he stubs a toe, he writes a 5-page letter to Sherman explaining how it's Hooker's fault. And Sherman's delighted to receive these missives. I should also point out at the same time, someone who's there during most of this campaign with Hooker, and he doesn't get mentioned. Dear old Dan Sickles is tagging along, recuperating and observing. Just who you want hanging around, writing letters to the President, to the Secretary of War, to his friends in Congress. So at the same time that Schofield is writing letters saying, Hooker is in my way, is slowing the crossing, Sickles is writing letters to the President going, you should have seen them throw back Hood's attack a few days ago. Now, Ben Scribner was mentioned earlier, and I just yesterday morning happened to pick up his book looking for any reference to Hooker to throw some final notes in. And I got this great piece from his memoirs, and this is around the time of Resaca. They used to call Fighting Joe Pugnacious Joe in the West. It sounded more offensive and made him sound less bright. And talking to another officer, Scribner reports, that officer said to me during the fight at Resaca, I take it all back, all that I have insinuated about PJ, Pugnacious Joe. For I notice in all of our, I read my own writing, in all of our councils of war, when he urges an assault upon the enemy, he's always willing to make it himself. And that caused Scribner's own observation. When Hooker was on my flank, I felt that he was always on the lookout to cooperate should the chance occur. Now that's not the Hooker we know or are told about by the likes of Sherman. That's a brigade commander saying, Hooker was looking out for us, looking out for opportunities to help us out. Anyway, that's just something I picked up yesterday morning as an aside. Now, the slow crossing may actually have saved Hooker from a bit of a bloody nose, because Thomas makes a bit of an error. He splits his corps in two parts, with Hooker's corps taking the Adairsville-Cassville road and the other two corps taking a more southerly road, if I got it right. And this is the occasion we talked of before, where Joe Johnston is considering a bit of an ambush. It's Hood who is given the job of jumping on any forces divided. And so this is the perfect opportunity. He's waiting along that Adairsville-Cassville road to jump on an opportunity. Now, Dan Butterfield is in the lead, and Dan Butterfield picks up his prisoners. He's on the alert. He goes into line quite quickly and sends word back going, something's up, something's not right. And Hooker's very quickly up there in support of Butterfield. Now, I'm astonished to say this is the occasion where George Stoneman redeems himself slightly, if Hooker did but know it, because it's his cavalry, I think, along with some elements of Kilpatrick's, that appear on Hood's flank and panic Hood into calling off the attack. And this was probably the best opportunity that Joe Johnston had. But having said that, it's Hooker, it's 20 corps. I think they would have made a good count of themselves had the trap been sprung. But we won't know. And again, say it with me, Joe Johnston withdraws towards Allatoona. Now, this is where Sherman tries to push Joe Johnston back with a wide flanking march over the Ottawa River towards Marietta. And again, although Hooker has crossed the river within a day this time, Schofield writes another one of his lovely letters saying, he's crossed in front of me, isn't it awful? Joe Johnston spots the flanking manoeuvre, gets on the road quickly and starts taking up positions at Dallas and Crossroads New York Church. Now again, Hooker is Thomas's choice to take the vanguard. Now, talking about Hooker, Hooker is personally very courageous. And on the 25th of May, at a place called Owen's Mill on Pumpkin Vine Creek, Hooker and Geary, with their bodyguards, come up on a bridge that's already on fire. The retreating rebels have set it on fire. Hooker, Geary, and their bodyguards are the ones that rush forward to try and put the fire out. And realizing they're coming under fire, Hooker detaches his own bodyguard to begin to push the rebel rear guard back, and they save the bridge. He's under fire the whole time. Now, whether that distracted them or not, sadly, the wonderful maps they were provided with did not have one of the roads that appeared in front of them. And Hooker and Geary made the decision to take the unmarked road, which they thought would take them to New Hope Church. Instead, it directed them more to Dallas, where at that point, Hood's corps was dug in. Now again, Hooker spots that they're in trouble quite quickly and directs Geary to push out his skirmishers aggressively and dig in, while he sends messages for Williams Butterfield to come up urgently. Now, Sherman wants Hooker to attack the rebels. They haven't got much of an idea of what's in front of them. And Sherman's not really interested in finding out. It's Hooker. Do as you're told. And Hooker says, this attack will not succeed. But he goes on to make the attack, because those are his orders. He's there in the thick of it. He's not a fool. He's not in the front line. But he knows that he needs to be on scene. So he's behind the first three brigade lines. He's on hand. And after the initial success that Williams has, they get pushed back by the well-entrenched rebels. Hooker doesn't prolong the agony. He's not going to reinforce defeat. He calls it off. And this is where Hooker and Sherman have their first real public ding-dong. I'm not sure whether that English slang translates into American, but Sherman berates Hooker. You waited too long before making the attack. And Hooker responds, and I don't think I can master the sarcastic tone that I think is implied. Sherman, you're right. The delay must have allowed Hood to receive at least 50 or 60 men in reinforcements. Now, he's not much involved in Biggs Mill and Dallas, and again, the advance commences, this time with Hooker in the rear. I suspect Thomas didn't have a lot to say in that, given that words had been had directly between Sherman and Hooker. But in any event, there's constant skirmishing with the rebels as they fall back in the direction of Kennesaw Mountain. Now again, young Cram, who I mentioned earlier, has another opportunity this time to see Hooker. And again, he writes about Hooker in the most glowing terms. A calm, placid look seems inevitable to him. When he passes the troops, he always smiles and looks upon us as a father. It does my soul good to hear the rousing cheers that greet him. Now, 15th of June, we've got Geary attacking Pine Mountain and one of Barfield's brigades attacking at Gilgal Church. They're in the thick of it, but this is where Sherman starts throwing around more general blame. Not just Hooker, not even just Thomas, but the whole Army of the Cumberland comes in for Sherman's abuse. The Army of the Cumberland is so habituated to be on the defensive that from its commander down to its lowest private, I cannot get it into their heads. And he's writing that to Grant. Now, Sherman's side is going to push Thomas and Schofield towards Marietta to threaten Joe Johnston's left. And again, Hooker is going to spearhead this advance. Now, I think we're getting to around the 22nd of June and the Battle of Coles Farm. Now, at first things go reasonably well with the Reb skirmishers being driven off, and Geary gets to an important height and Hooker basically has him dig in on that ridge because, and this is where things begin to get controversial, Hooker's taken prisoners and he identifies those prisoners as being from two of the infantry corps and from the cavalry corps. So as far as he's concerned, he has elements of all the rebel army in front of him, and he communicates that. Now I want to put that in context. The prisoners taken at Chancellorsville and the intelligence they provided was largely ignored and laughed at. So Hooker is probably more sensitive to the intelligence provided by prisoners than perhaps he ought to be. Now the other thing is, Sherman might never become aware of that, but he's ignoring Thomas and writing directly to Hooker. And of course Hooker replies directly. When your commanding general writes to you, you don't then ignore him and pass it up through the appropriate chain of command. So Sherman is deriding Hooker because Sherman knows he doesn't have the whole army in front of him. Sherman can see the other elements elsewhere on the battlefield. But he doesn't tell Hooker that. No one ever says to Hooker, thanks for the information, but by the way, our intelligence elsewhere on the battlefield is that these elements of the rebel army are over there. Just an opportunity for Sherman to say, Hooker's an idiot. Now, Hooker also sends another message, which is, I am concerned about our left flank. And that also causes Sherman to go, to use another colloquial phrase, completely mental. Because Sherman, in his memoirs, says, Schofield's on the left flank. Hooker's got nothing to worry about. He's insinuating that Schofield's not there. Well, I know he's there. Now, things are bad when you have to rely on Schofield to help you out. And even Schofield says after the event, Hooker said, our flank. We're all in the same damn army. He meant my left flank. because if we're facing the whole army, which is perhaps what Hooker thought, then Schofield's left flank is potentially in danger. Now, if Schofield is not taking the opportunity to misinterpret you, because he thinks it's obvious, I think Sherman's out on a bit of a limb. And also, to be fair, Schofield also says the story, as told in Sherman's memoirs, is nonsense. Because Schofield features in person in the arguments that Hooker and Sherman would have after this battle. He goes, I wasn't there. I heard about it afterwards. In any event, when Hood does attack, once again, it's Williams who does most of the heavy lifting of throwing Hood back. So it's a good battle for 20 Corps, but for this nonsense around, I might have the whole army in front of me, and our flank is in the air. So we've got two confrontations now in public between Hooker and Sherman. Thomas is perfectly happy with Hooker. Hooker divisional commanders are delighted. Williams says, under Hooker, our corps has had the fighting share. It seems we are always in advance, and now the Westerners call us ironclads. Now, Hooker sticks it out at the moment. Dan Butterfield has no interest in sticking things out. He's disgusted by the way that 20 Corps is being treated, and he resigns. And that's where our friend William T. Ward steps up to take over Butterfield's division. And we're on our way to towards Chattahoochee. Definitely thought that was made up the first time I read it. W.T. Ward, it's his first time in division command. He probably needs a little Dutch courage. I'm afraid he drank most of the dike on the way there. Thankfully, Hooker it has decided that as Ward it's his first time, Hooker's going to be close on hand. So when they realise that, again, Johnson's in front of them and dug in, and the order is given to halt, and Ward continues forward, Hooker's close on hand to get up there and realise that Ward is probably only capable of staying on his horse just. And again, manages to halt the division, throw out skirmishers aggressively, while getting up the rest of his corps as quickly as possible to dig them out of the hole they're in. Now, it's about this time that Hooker gets his first sight of Atlanta. And it's also about this time that we find out that Hood's taking over. Now, this is interesting because almost every time Hooker's got into a fight, it's with Hood. And they've both got a little bit of form in commanding officers in order to gain command. They're not dissimilar in some ways, but I think Hooker is by some distance the superior soldier in terms of tactically, operationally, organisationally. And I just quote Williams again from around this time about Hooker. He is indeed a strange man, but the men like him, as he's always seen when a fight is in progress. In truth, Hooker hates to be left behind. He's restless, prompt, sometimes impatient, but he's always fighting Joe. Charles Harding Cox writes a very strange letter to one of his family members. I've almost fallen a little bit in love with Joe. Now, Peachtree Creek. I will admit this is the one I know the least about. Well, take a punt on it. So, Hooker's advancing, and it comes to his attention, this time from the prisoners, he's right. He got Hood's army in front of him. And so he immediately starts rushing troops forward to fill the gap between Newton and Palmer. Now, thankfully, Hood rather fumbles the attack, and he attacks in echelon from east to west. So Ward gets it first. Now his skirmishers are well pushed out, slow things down. And by the time they're pushed back onto Ward's main line, he's ready. And he really cuts up Hood's advance in front of him. Geary has a much harder time. His flank gets exposed by a brigade of Alabamians, chaps from Albanians, chaps from Alabama and Louisiana, and things get pretty rough. It looks as though he might be rolled up. Geary does have a reserve brigade, and it appears at the critical moment with Hooker at the head. And it's one of the troops there quotes Hooker. He leads them into position, and at the top of his voice, "Boys, I guess we'll stop here." He seems to always be in the right place at the right time, and he pulls Geary out of the fire, and in that part of the field, Hood's attack is pushed back. Williams, again, probably the most competent, again, has little difficulty pushing back Hood's attack. Now, at this point, it should be noted that a number of men in 24 note that when Hooker rides down the line, there is cheering from regiment to regiment to regiment. He is incredibly popular. And to contrast that, I should quote Sherman. And this is as reported by one of Thomas's staff officers, a chap by the name of Stone. And when he's presented with the figures of 20 corps losses that day, he's reported to have said, "Oh well, most of them will be back in a day or two." It might be a throwaway line, but he doesn't give them their due. Those are dead and in the majority. And he's commented that they're just runaways. Most of them will be back in a day or two. Not looking good for Sherman, looking at things from Hooker's perspective. So, it's comments like these that provoke Hooker to more and more public outbursts about Sherman in the presence of both his staff officers and other staff officers. And even though Butterfield has resigned, he still knows this is going on. He's hearing it through his own grapevine. And he's writing to Hooker going, "For God's sake, stop. Yes, you're right. But for God's sake, don't say it out loud. You're doing yourself no good. And when it's not you and it's others, you're the one that's going to get the blame." And he's not wrong. But it is observed by other officers not directly connected with Hooker, and they blame Sherman. Henry Stone, I'm sure, is one of Thomas's staff officers. From the beginning, General Sherman has shown unrelenting prejudice against Hooker, had listened willfully to every piece of gossip about him, and done what he could to belittle his service. Now, dear old McPherson dies at the head of the Army of the Tennessee and is temporarily replaced by Black Jack Logan. Now, I have a very high opinion of Black Jack Logan, but Black Jack Logan had, as a war Democrat, something in common with the Republican Hooker. He had what you used to call in the Royal Navy interest. He had political connections. They were potential long-term rivals of Sherman's. And when I say that, think about it at that point in time. No one knows that Sherman is going to carry out the march to the sea. It's entirely possible that something can go wrong one day and Sherman will face plant. Let's face it, Sherman has face planted a couple of times before in the war. He had a very bad day at Shiloh. He has some very bad days in the early war. But he's been junior, he's had Grant to protect him. If he has a bad day now, as an army commander, as an army group commander, he can go the way of McDowell, of McClellan, of Burnside, of Buell, and he knows it. And he knows people with the political pull to pull that off and replace it are either going to be someone like Blackjack Logan, an essential war Democrat in the run-up to an election, or Fighting Joe, who is the beloved of the radical Republicans and immortal enemy of George Britton McClellan. So, taking the rumours about their bad relationship from California and the threat that Hooker posed, as well as Blackjack, I don't think either of them stood any chance of being appointed to command of the Army of the Tennessee. And almost immediately, Sherman is writing letters to defend the decision he's about to make. Hooker has not the moral qualities I want. Howard has. I wonder what those moral qualities are. Now, when Hooker finds out that the job has been offered to O.O. Howard, and this is where I have to give you the trigger warning, O.O. Howard's about to be misgendered. Hooker writes, Howard was always a woman among troops. If he was not born in petticoats, he ought to have been. And it's at that point that Hooker tenders his resignation. He can't put up with the treatment any longer. And to be fair to Hooker, that treatment has resulted in 20 Corps being forced to make attacks they perhaps ought not to have made had another commander been in place. It certainly has caused the efforts of 20 Corps to be denigrated by Sherman when they should have been lauded. But it was probably the wrong move for Hooker. And just to show how vulnerable Sherman felt, this is a line that he wrote in a letter to Halleck. Hooker was a fool. If he'd waited a few weeks, he could have marched into Atlanta and claimed all the honours. He was a rival. He was driven out of that army by Sherman. Yes, he probably had too much pride, as I say, the insubordinate subordinate. That's his reputation. Thomas didn't find it to be so. Sherman, dismissive and defensive, not just of Hooker, but of everyone who became associated with Hooker, which effectively was the whole 20 Corps while Hooker was in charge. McPherson inconveniently dead. That brought the issue to a head, because McPherson wasn't political, Thomas wasn't political, and while Schofield was political, he didn't have the interest. He was reliant on Sherman and Grant. That was his interest. Howard, always a woman, and of course, who gets appointed to replace Hooker? I mean, he's not short of people who meet him, but Slocum is almost gleeful in his acceptance to replace Hooker. He hates Hooker. To be fair, Hooker reciprocates in full. But what about the men? Well, it's Alpheus Williams, incredibly good divisional commander, a solid soldier. It was a blue day when Hooker left us. So, I have to say that while some of this Hooker's redemption has been a little tongue-in-cheek, I'm asking you to think again about Hooker's reputation. Hooker has been incredibly ill-served by both his peers and their biographers. And this is it when it comes to Hooker's biographies. Walter Herbert wrote this in, I think, 1944. And it's fun. It's a good read, but I would not say it is the most academically rigorous work I've ever read. And he is in dire need of someone to revisit his biography. In my view, and I appreciate that we can argue about this in the bar later, he's probably the best Corps commander in that phase. I think he's tactically and operationally expert at this point. He's probably not had army command long enough to test his strategic thought. I think he does a good job at Chancellorsville, but we're not talking about that right up to the minute the building falls on his head. Probably a little earlier when he decides to stop in the wilderness. Was he really too political and insubordinate? And here's the key phrase, compared to his peers. And consider who his peers were. John Schofield. Were you to ask Thomas oblivious to all this behaviour, but if you were to ask Thomas, having seen all the correspondence of Hooker and Schofield, who was the most political and insubordinate, Hooker would have been picked. Sherman is incredibly political. If you ever want to read his letters between him and his brother John, you will struggle to work out which one is the senator. And I have to say that looking at this from Hooker's point of view and 20 Corps' point of view, I have to say I have found Sherman's role and his character deeply wanting. Deeply wanting. Tactically, operationally, and guilty, he's very good. But his attitude as a commander is appalling. Be rude about Hooker. God knows Hooker's rude back. But don't denigrate the deaths and injuries in his corps because you think the commander's better than us. It's an appalling way to behave. And it's coloured my view of Sherman. So I would just ask you to think fresh about Joe Hooker. Both he and I thank you. And if there are any questions, now's the time.